Shadow people. So we've all seen the memes where it'll be like my sleep paralysis demon this, my sleep paralysis demon that. What that meme is in reference to is shadow people or like shadow figures, shadow phenomenon, right? So I want to jump into that, and I was thinking about like where does that come from? What is that all about? So shadow people is kind of perplexing. It's definitely something that's been prominent amongst a bunch of different cultures for a really, really long time. And so I want to get into the first one I want to get into is like the most prominent, the most talked about one, and that's the Hat Man. The Hat Man is a shadow figure that many people have come across. Imagine him as a tall, shadowy figure with a wide brimmed hat, standing at the doorway of your room or standing in the corner of your room. And for this particular shadow person or being or whatever, it's not necessarily just that it's like scary, but people who see him or have seen him describe him as having like a sense of authority or intimidation. They say that he radiates some kind of intensity, right? A lot of the terminology used in relation to the Hat Man specifically, people will say that he has a very penetrating gaze, which is usually accompanied by overwhelming sense of unease. And yeah, there's a bunch of experiences that are published on like forums or YouTube videos. I'm sure you can find a YouTube video of someone giving their personal experience with the Hat Man. And this kind of stuff has led to a whole bunch of theories as to where the Hat Man came from, who he is, what are his purpose. Up next, I want to mention shadow beings. Moving on from the Hat Man. The first thing I want to say about this is I understand how generic of a term shadow beings is. Like just the label of shadow beings, right? This name pretty much says it all. These are humanoid figures, beings, but they're just shadows, living shadows. Unlike the Hat Man, these beings don't have any defining features, no clothes, robes, nothing. They're just shadows. Sometimes people even describe them as being shapeless, so more of just a humanoid shape, not necessarily like limbs and everything. They're usually described as a dark, eerie silhouette. And from what I understand, they're usually described as like smooth, almost liquid. And again, when it comes to the intentions or the nature of these ones, these specific like shadow figures or shadow beings, it's completely up for speculation as to what their nature or intention is. The next one on our list is a type of hooded figure. Sometimes they're called cloaked shadows. And again, the name pretty much says it all. These are like dark hooded figures who stand out specifically because of their dark robes. Some would even call it a cloak. This is one of the ones that people not only run into like in the woods or like in day-to-day life or in haunted places, but this one is also kind of associated with sleep paralysis. This is one of the common ones that people see with sleep paralysis type phenomenon. Another kind of shadow being or figure is called a red-eyed shadow. Just as the name implies, are these shadowy figures with red piercing eyes, obviously. Glowing. People who have come into contact with these ones often describe an overwhelming sense of fear. They feel like they're being watched or followed or stalked even. Another one of the words that is often used to describe this particular one is the word menacing. So a lot of people think these are menacing, like with intention of causing harm. The origins, the definitive origins, are like a complete mystery. Some people believe these ones to be a supernatural entity, so like a type of a ghost or more related to demons or spirits. And some schools of thought would classify these as like a manifestation of like dark energy. So this could be like part of like a curse, or like if you're just in a really negative headspace, or you're thinking a lot of negative thoughts, or someone's projecting negative thoughts at you, this entity with glowing red eyes, right, is going to be manifested into your life through like negative thought. And regardless of how these things come about, I'm sure it's absolutely terrifying to see one of these things. In a little bit of a twist on like the shadow being, shadow entity thing, there's one type called like shadow animals or like a shadow creature kind of thing, right? Most of the focus on this like genre or this topic tends to be focused on like humanoid type of shadow people, shadow figures. Subcategory of like shadow animals I think is really interesting too. They're not like your typical, animal. They're usually described as a shadow that resembles an existing animal though. If there was a cat, but it's just a black empty, or if like it was a horse, they're described as like a A horse made out of shadow, just emptiness, darkness. Based on everything I've read, this is more like of a European kind of thing, like the Black Dog. That one specifically is much more of like a United Kingdom thing. So like this is like more common in like Ireland and England and all those places. Just from what I understood, what I was able to find and read about. Up next we have the Watchers. These ones are described as being shadow beings or shadow figures that specifically watch you from a distance. People who have witnessed these or have had encounters with these, or the stories that I've been able to find like on forums or anything, they are described as continuously watching you from a distance, observing you. You're constantly being watched, and you can like feel it. You can kind of feel the sense of being watched. It's never really a close encounter. Like I wouldn't see one in my room, but as soon as I leave my house, the car parked down a block, I would like see one out of the corner of my eye. And once I like go to like really focus on it and look at it to confirm what I saw, it's gone, right? And a lot of stuff like that, or like it'll give you a moment to really focus on it and really see it for what it is, and then as soon as like you blink or like you look away and look back, it's gone, right? So it's more vigilant, it's overseeing you. And this one is also described, this one specifically is like in groups, so it's like multiple of them, so you'll see like groups of like 3 or 4 or however many, right? Based on what I was able to find on these, there's no mention specifically of these things being specifically evil or menacing or having like negative intent. So I think it's entirely possible to witness a watcher or like have some kind of encounter with a watcher without it being absolutely completely terrifying. I think it's something that could be experienced without evil intent. So supposedly, allegedly. And you might be wondering, or you might think like where the origins of these kinds of things come from. These sort of like shadow apparitions, right? Shadow beings, shadow people. We can look all the way back and find like ancient representations of like descriptions of these kinds of beings in a whole bunch of different cultures and like religions and stuff. So pretty much through the entirety of like recorded human history, there have been documented occurrences of these like mysterious shadow beings. Ancient Egyptian shadow beings. In ancient Egyptian mythology, there are references to a shadow being known as Kayal. I think I'm saying that right. So these ones are believed to be spirits or like shades of death. And I think when they say like shade, it's like an echo of a death or like an echo of a life that is lost or someone who has passed. And these ones are heavily associated in the Egyptian culture with like the afterlife and the realm of the dead. And it was said that the Kayal could interact with like the living world and living beings. I'm sure through like some kind of like seance or like ritual, or I'm sure it was a big piece of like the religion of the time. Greek mythology also has mentions of a type of shadow being, shadowy spirits known as Idola, or Idolones. These ones are also thought like ghosts of individuals who had passed, human beings who are either in transition to the spirit world or like are spirits from the spirit world. And again, with like the same thing in Greek mythology, there's always the same thing in Roman mythology. The Romans had a concept of a spirit shadow entity called the umbrae or umbrae. With this kind of like ancient representation of these beings, they're more related toward like spirits and like the afterlife. Celtic folklore also has a type of shadow being known as the Beanside. I'll spell it right here. Beanside, or more commonly known as the Banshee. The Banshee is described as like a female figure with like cloaked in a dark shadow with like a veil. And this one is like super associated with like malintent, and it's like it's a predictor of like death or tragedy or like something horrible is gonna happen. So it's definitely a bad luck thing if you see one of these. And this is like a message from the spirit world or the afterlife of these, these types of disasters. I want to finish up this like cultural part of the shadow being discussion with Native American folklore and by addressing like the shadow entities in Native American folklore. There's a whole bunch of different tribes, obviously, and they all have their own individual legends and stories, parables, and some of them even, obviously, since we're talking about it now, they have mentions of shadow people or types of shadow people or things that could be like assumed to be shadow figure related, shadow entity related. The Navajo people, for example, they have this concept of a thing called a chindi. which is a reference to like a malevolent spirit, or you could describe it as a ghost that lingers, specifically in the shadows of the woods or on like sacred land. These ones, I guess the backstory to these ones is that they are the spirits of people who have deceased, and they're like scared to pass on to the afterlife. One of the little nuances about these ones is that they're described as like being afraid of people, but they're also afraid of passing on to the afterlife. So there's just like a lot of fear. This is like a fearful spirit. In some accounts, some it's described like that. Also, another I just want to throw in another culturally significant one actually that I found was the jinn. Sometimes it's spelled jinn, or sometimes it's spelled jinn with a D. This one is prominent in like Islamic cultures, Islamic belief systems, right? And these are supernatural beings that allegedly their origin is that they come from a smokeless fire, and these things live in an entirely separate dimension that is like parallel to our dimension. And the main thing, like the main characteristic of these, is that they have free will, so they could be good, they could be bad, they could be neutral. They're just like us, that they have like free will, they have the ability to make choices and stuff. Most of the time, these are actually portrayed as like invisible entities, but they're not always stuck that way, so they can shapeshift and transform. And while they're not like specifically tied to like the shadow figure phenomenon, the reason that I bring them up is because a big part of the folklore with these ones is that they very often take, or they have the ability to take the form of like a shadow being, shadow-esque, right? They're also known for kind of being like hidden or playing like tricks, being kind of like tricksters, which also falls into like their ability to shapeshift. So they like shapeshift on occasion for the specific purpose of being like mischievous pranksters. Yeah, and these ones pop up in Islamic texts and folklore. I definitely think they're one that deserves a little bit more of a look into. Moving on to the land of the rising sun. All right, so in Japanese folklore, there's a creature called the faceless ghost, or the Nopera Bo. I'm gonna just call it the faceless ghost just because I don't want to mispronounce it. This allegedly goes back in Japanese folklore a couple centuries. This one's mostly known as a shape-shifting yokai, which is yokai is essentially just a fancy word for shapeshifter, a supernatural being, meaning this thing can take the shape of a human if it wants to. More commonly is known as like a shadowy faceless figure. No facial features, no nose, no lips, no mouth, no eyes, nothing, nada. One of the things that I read that is specifically linked to just this is that it will disguise itself as like a person, right? And then it can reveal its like true form suddenly, like out of nowhere. And I think according to the Japanese folklore, that aspect of what's lying beneath the surface that we don't know, that's probably like the scarier bit, right? Like that's the main detail about these ones. Throwing in the variable of what's beneath the surface is like the main aspect of that. Really quick, I want to take it back to the Native American folklore and just touch on something else real quick. I forgot to mention stick Indians. And there's like a whole treasure trove of like information on Native American stuff in general. So if you guys want to look into that, I highly recommend it. There's like a treasure trove of Native American folklore. These ones are described as like long, slender, dark beings, shadowy figures that hide in the trees. Again, also hide in forests and groves and protect native land from intruders. And in some Native American traditions, these aren't necessarily friendly beings. Definitely have the ability to be like malicious or malevolent, especially to folks that are not being respectful towards the land. They blend in right into the darkness. They're kind of like long, twisted, like branch like, camouflage type of figures. The emphasis on these ones is like their ability to disguise and blend in with the woods and the trees and stuff at night, in the dark. I want to add on a personal note, I think that these are more than just like a legend. I think they're like a parable almost. They're not just meant to scare us. I think they're more of like a cautionary tale of kind of like respect the land, respect the territory. And of course, the details of these things kind of vary from tribe to tribe and region to region, right? Between indigenous groups. And different lineages obviously have their different layers to this and different inputs into this specific type of thing. In European folklore, I had mentioned earlier the black dog, right? How that's like a UK type of thing. So this is like a spectral spiritual creature usually takes the form of a large, dark colored canine. Some accounts say that it's like wolf size, right? This one is depicted as like an omen, right? So it can mean a lot of things, whether it's like death or misfortune, illness, disaster. This one is definitely just not a good sign. You don't want to be seeing this one ever. Also, might be a sign of like supernatural occurrences, like a haunting or a curse or like stuff like that. This one is also a type that is like kind of lurking in the distance. It's very rare that there's like an up close encounter type of experience with these. They're like just in the distance, right, out of the corner of the eye. And these also have been said to have like the glowing red eyes from time to time. Not every single one, but it's definitely, I've found some instances of it, people saying that it's like part of the lore. Black Dog is also a really badass Led Zeppelin song that if you haven't checked it out or listened to it, I recommend you check it out if you've never heard it. We had talked about sleep paralysis and what does sleep paralysis have to do with, you know, the entire shadow phenomenon type of thing. It's actually one of the biggest like contributors to like the conversation. So when that line is blurred between the waking world and being asleep and consciousness and unconsciousness, and shadow figures start to make their way into this, what's the connection? Where does the connection happen there? Like I said, I know you guys have all seen the memes. So during an episode of sleep paralysis, people will find themselves in a state of in between consciousness and unconscious, completely frozen, unable to move, speak. Something happens to our brains in this state of paralysis where there's like a trigger of hallucinations, vivid hallucinations, and like a heightened sense of fear and paranoia. And psychologically, I mean, this triggers a bunch of stuff. A bunch of stuff is going on in the brain at this point in time. And this can trigger, you know, those visual hallucinations of shadow figures, the demon in the corner of the room. And when you're in that kind of place, the brain loves to play tricks. This is where people come in and say, you know, they've had these experiences with these shadow entities, these dark humanoid figures. A lot of people say they see the Hat Man, right, or just dark shadow figures, or even some people say they feel them like putting pressure on their chest or like on top of them on the bed, holding them down, that kind of stuff. In most cases, our brains attempt at just trying to make sense of these hallucinations and make sense of the sensory input information that we're getting. And it may be drawn in part from like cultural influences and some psychological influences, because this, I'm sure it's like a distressing experience, so your brain is doing whatever it can, and sometimes it comes up with this kind of stuff, right? This for sure tends to be the most common and most recognized form of encounter with like sleep paralysis demons, or like shadow figures, shadow beings, all this stuff. I was trying to see if I could find anyone, like a specific person who gave like a good detailed account of their experience with like a sleep paralysis demon. I did find one woman. Her name is Heidi Hollis. She's an author and a researcher into like this kind of stuff. And she's publicly shared her story, her experiences with the Hat Man and dealing with sleep paralysis. She's written a book. I'll link the book down below if you guys want to check it out. She describes waking up in the middle of the night. She describes her experience like this. She was waking up in the middle of the night, room completely shrouded in darkness. Very eerie feeling in the air when she's waking up. And she describes this feeling of overwhelming malevolence, just a feeling of fear, a lot of dread. And she observed this tall, dark figure, this entity at the foot of her bed. This figure was dressed in a long coat, brimmed hat, had no visible face, no features on the face, and radiated this like dark negative energy over her, right, as she's in bed. She couldn't move, she couldn't talk, she couldn't do anything. She was paralyzed. She said that she was paralyzed by the fear. She had tried to scream, but you know, she found herself voiceless. She described it as it felt endless, right? This experience, this encounter. And she said that it almost appeared to study her and like watch her before it completely just vanished. And this experience left an impression on her, and she, you know, she's kind of dived into her research and her writing. This kind of fueled her curiosity to dive deeper into the phenomenon in general, shadow people, sleep paralysis, all that kind of stuff. The nature of them, what does it mean when we encounter them, how do we encounter them, when do we encounter them, the impact that they have on the people that kind of go through this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I mean, there is scientific explanation for some of these kinds of experiences. Some of it is like folklore, mythology kind of stuff. But the more scientific explanation is that it's a hypnagogic state or hypnopompic state. It's just super vivid experiences that happen when we're kind of in between awake and asleep. Our brain is trying to put all this information together. It's like a waking dream kind of cast over your reality. Your brain's just, wires are kind of crossed sometimes. And they feel incredibly real because they're coming from, they're coming from in here, coming from inside of us. They're coming from our references, our memories. And when you're in a dark room, I mean, it kind of makes sense. And I mean, when our brain's coming up with this kind of stuff, it kind of makes sense that it would omit a lot of the details because your brain's just kind of mixing a bunch of references together. And I do want to bring up that shadow people and like shadow beings have kind of made their, mark on popular culture in like movies and TV and literature and stuff. So in the world of cinema, the movie Mara from 2018 is a prime example. This one's directed by Clive Tong. I think it's Clive Tong. This movie actually just dives into the topic of sleep paralysis completely. Specifically involves like the terrifying creature like behind sleep paralysis. It's about a criminal psychologist and he's investigating a bunch of deaths that are related to sleep paralysis. And in this process, he encounters a shadow figure that's called Mara. And this being torments their victims in their sleep. And then like on TV shows, like on the small screen, there's shows like Supernatural that touch on the subject, and then another show called Fringe that also kind of bring up the subject of shadow figures, shadow beings. I think Supernatural is a really good show. I watched like the first like 5 seasons. I think it's a really good show. If you like theology kind of related stuff, I'd give it a watch. I'll check it out, I guess. And since we're on the topic of like culture, it's definitely had a mark on literature. I think it's completely appropriate to bring up where we can see these things pop up in books. Authors like H.P. Lovecraft and Neil Gaiman have definitely used like the idea, the concept in their writing. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft is like a grand master of like horror writing, especially like super old style horror writing, right? 'Cause he was writing a long time ago. And Lovecraft uses shadow people as a cosmic kind of entity. They're like ancient and unknowable. His take on them is that they like to mess with the sanity of anyone who stumbles upon them. Stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Call of Cthulhu, they kind of, touch on the subject in a very imaginative way, for sure. I think Neil Gaiman uses references for shadow figures, shadow beings in American Gods. The protagonist, Shadow Moon, has encounters with all kinds of like mythological beings, which include shadow people. I like the way that they're kind of brought up in literature because it's not necessarily like just spooky scary. They're kind of more creative. They're used as like representations of fear, much less like just a spooky being, right? They're kind of more metaphorical. I wouldn't be able to say specifically, but I just looked at like some reference material, and it's not just like a spooky black figure. They're more like a meaning behind it. Do I know the meaning? No. Yeah, so I mean that's pretty much it. That's all I got for this video. I want to extend a thank you to whoever checked out this video. I really do appreciate it. Talking about shadow people, man, I've been writing this script for a while, so I think it's interesting. I don't have any personal experiences with this kind of stuff, but I'm just really happy to be working on like this type of content, exploring this kind of material, making these kind of videos. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. Hit the thumbs up. It helps me out. I mean, I'm trying to get the ball rolling here, and I would really appreciate it. It helps the algorithm, all that stuff. If you want, you can check out my socials too. I'm gonna drop my socials down below. You don't have to, but if you want to, they're down there. More importantly, I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think about this? Do you have any experiences with shadow people? I think I've for sure have had the sleep paralysis thing. I don't think I've had like a sleep paralysis demon or anything, but I've definitely had sleep paralysis. I didn't see anything though when it happened to me. If you got any stories to tell, please like drop it down below because I do want to read some stuff. I'd love to check that stuff out. If you have any topics that you want me to talk about too, your input is like super valuable. So go ahead and let me know. And once again, I just want to thank you guys for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a good night.